Good evening, and welcome to our panel tonight on Galaxies, Glaciers, and Deep Time, a conversation between artists, scientists, and humanists. My name is Lutz. Good evening, and welcome to our panel tonight on Galaxies, Glaciers, and Deep. My name is Lutz Koepnick. I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University in Cinema and Media Arts and German Studies. And more importantly, I'm a person deeply devoted to how galaxies, glaciers, and contemporary art make us think about questions of deep planetary time and history. As you all know, or many of you know, today's panel was originally meant to take place at Dyer Observatory and also invite you all to take a look at the stars through its magnificent telescope. And I think the clear skies tonight would have been wonderful in order to do so. But alas, the road conditions at Dyer's Magic Mountain continue to remain somewhat hazardous after the snow and ice we had this week. So for the sake of everyone's safety, we decided to move this event into virtual space, which should and will definitely not keep us from having a stimulating discussion among our panelists. And after about an hour, also hope to invite you to ask questions and contribute your comments. Let me upfront thank Billy Teets from the Dyer Observatory to opening his now virtual doors to this event, Marianne Caton at Vanderbilt for organizing all the bits and pieces, and Amanda Hellman and her staff at the Vanderbilt University Museum of Art for all the work and effort it took to get No Footprints Even, and the work of Jessica Houston to Nashville. So what's the subject of our panel tonight? In 1650, the Irish theologian James Ussher announced that Earth was created, listen, on October 22nd, 4004 BC, which happened to be a Saturday afternoon. Our planet, in fact, the world, was no older than 6,000 years, he calculated, after a very, very close reading of the book of Genesis. Less than 200 years later, in the wake of the rise of modern geology around 1800, Earth suddenly looked much older. So old, in fact, that human minds struggled for some time, perhaps still do, to come to terms with these durations. The writer John McPheen coined the term deep time in 1981. He meant to describe the immensity of time it took Earth to produce the kind of hospitable conditions that made life possible as we know it. The layering of different geological strata below our feet that document the slow and timeful, not the timeless movement of planetary history. But it was our modern age that allowed us to recognize deep time. And yet we moderns haven't turned out to be not the best stewards of our timeful environments. Our clocks tick fast, our patience dwindles very quickly, memories fade ever faster unless captured by all kinds of media gadgets, and questions about our obligations towards the well-being of distant futures appear ever more anachronistic. It's dire time, therefore, to have more good conversations about the meaning of deep time today. And this is what we want to do today, here, today. Our interdisciplinary panel is inspired by the current exhibition, No Footprints Even, at the Vanderbilt University Museum of Art. It features recent work by Montreal-based artist Jessica Houston, different projects that all tackle the legacy of polar exploration and travel, that explore the relation of modern science and the arts, and that ask tough questions about the footprints humans are leaving on this old and ever-new planet. In one of her projects, Jessica has buried a capsule with 22 handwritten letters into an Antarctic glacier. It is calculated to reach the open sea in about 1,000 years. No one has seen these letters, except the authors themselves, not even Houston. What she does with this piece, on some level, is to invite us to imagine their messages and think about our own present through the lens of deep time. She asks us, her audience, to envision our place in the long history of our planet with renewed sensitivity. Today's panel is meant to do this. Unseal those letters a little bit. Ask what deep time means for us as citizens, artists, scientists, and humanists, whether we study Earth or the origin of distant galaxies in times far, far away. I'm super excited about having Jessica present today as one of our speakers. She, in fact, has been here in Nashville for the past week and involved in all kinds of programs. And I'm very grateful for other panelists to contribute to this conversation as well. I'll ask Jessica to introduce herself in a moment, but at this point, let me just briefly introduce our other panelists. We have Billy Teets, who is the director of Dyer Observatory and its resident astronomer. He holds a PhD in astrophysics from Vanderbilt, where he also actively collaborates with the Vanderbilt's Physics and Astronomy department and teaches intros to astronomy. We'll have Clara Wilch, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Robert Penn Warren Center at Vanderbilt. She received her PhD from UCLA in 2023 in theater and performance studies, and is currently writing a book that illuminates the climatic influence of ice skate performances, as she calls it, set in Inuit co-governed territory in Nunavut in Canada. Then we have Dan Morgan. He's a trained geologist and currently a principal senior lecturer in earth and environmental sciences at Vanderbilt. His research and teaching focuses on the glacial history of Earth, with an emphasis on Antarctica. We're really lucky to have him here because he just returned from a 2-month research trip to Antarctica, which exposed his undergraduate student researchers for the first time to the many challenges of working and, I suppose, camping in the polar regions. And finally, we have with us Jana Harper, who is an artist and a professor of the practice at Vanderbilt. Her interdisciplinary work explores themes and tensions between materiality and spirituality, between chance and human willfulness. She explores place, sociability, and human acts of meaning-making in her work. She is one of the co-curators of No Footprints Even, and has worked admirably over a very extensive period, not 1,000 years, but a pretty long period of time to bring Jessica's work and the question it raises to Nashville. We have prepared, I want to talk about sort of 4 clusters of themes today, and then also open up to questions that you as an audience might have, or thoughts and comments. Themes that revolve around issues of deep time, about science and art, about the kind of costs of the discovery, the footprints that scientists leave when doing their work, and then address issues such as the relationship of the physical and the metaphysical once we explore these deep times of history in different types of work. Let's start with some thoughts on deep time. As I said earlier, Jessica's Letters to the Future, her project that's at the heart of the exhibit at Vanderbilt, encourages us to think about the relation of deep time and human-centered histories, and how greater attention to geological, planetary, or even galactic timescales may guide us to tread more lightly on Earth. Maybe, Jessica, we can start our discussion tonight by having you talk a bit about sort of what brought you to do this kind of work, sort of what it means as an artist, and how you became an artist who thinks about timescales as large as 1,000 years. So why don't you start, Jessica?
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Dyer for hosting us tonight, to the Vanderbilt University Museum of Art, and especially to Jana and Lutz for co-curating the exhibition and for bringing me here to Nashville. It's been a really great week seeing students and general public and working, really just using the exhibition as a platform for having discussions, which, I'm happy to be here tonight because that just continues that. And I couldn't agree more with Lutz, just how important it is to continue talking together across disciplines to tease out, the difficult questions, and also with humor and care and love and collaboration. So just a big thanks for that. It's hard to be the one who starts, but here I am. I think that for me, it's really the question of deep time. It's like a combination of a conceptual framework and a material reality in my practice. And in particular, in the project, The Letters to the Future, ICE as an archive, it's sort of an incredible site for a thought experiment, as well as, just the reality of the fact that right now, while we're sitting here, those words that are embedded in the ice are slowly moving. And that the ice has actually its own temporality and its own rhythm and its own pacing, and the slowness of that movement, I think, is something extraordinary for us to be able to lean into, especially in that's what you were talking about, the sort of accelerated pace that we all experience in sort of our day and age. So there's something quite, I think, fundamental to the rhythm that's important, with also the way that ice kind of collapses deep time into the present moment as it's, melting, and the archives are kind of opening up into our present time. That's something quite also remarkable. But I think more than anything, it's the perspective that deep time can offer us in terms of an ethics of care, of our participation, and understanding that our present moment actually is creating our future as we're living into it, and in the sort of strangeness of time being sort of all time, so that if we can kind of allow the magnitude of deep time to lend us a different view and a different perspective, that it could really change, just the way we operate on an everyday basis. Those are my thoughts for now on that.
Great, great. Thanks. I will definitely come back also to this question of an ethics of care when thinking in longer sort of scales. Let me sort of maybe open it up to the other panelists here as well. Billy, you're sort of as an astrophysicist, you're not only dealing with the stars, but you're in far, far spaces, but you also really deal with far away times and sort of looking for much older history somehow. What does deep time mean for you in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say that deep time is really prevalent in basically every aspect of the field that I deal with. When we have visitors come to the observatory, whether we're talking about stars that are close by or galaxies that are millions of light years away, this concept of deep time is very pervasive. I mean, whenever we're looking out into the universe, we are essentially looking backwards in time. And one of the examples that I thought of, especially as we were thinking of like human history and the development of the human species, our nearest big galaxy to us, the Andromeda Galaxy, the light that we're getting from that galaxy today, it left that galaxy about 2.5 million years ago. Human civilization wasn't around then. Did a little digging, and this was the time that around the time that one of our very distant ancestors, Lucy, what was it, Australopithecus afarensis, she was walking around and may have looked up and actually seen this object. So and this is something that anybody can go out on a really dark night and be able to see and realize. It gives you a better perspective of just how vast this cosmos is, to see something up in the sky and say, I'm not looking at it as it is now, I'm actually seeing it as it was millions of years ago. So especially in terms of astronomy, I think that really gives people a much better perspective of just kind of how insignificant we are here on this planet.
Great. Clara, you've worked a lot, well, not in Antarctica, I understand, but in the Arctic regions, and working also with indigenous populations there and their sort of performative and theatrical productions. I'm sure sort of encounters with different kind of temporalities with deeper times are critical for your work as well.
Yeah, so enjoying listening to these answers, and I think, yeah, I mean, of course, deep time is very important to understand what a glacier is, and to thinking about another center of my research, which is climate change and the long roots of our contemporary climate in, longer processes of carbon emissions, of settler colonialism and racialized capitalism. Um, and there are a lot of people who are sort of fixated on the challenges of understanding or comprehending deep time, but I think it is a misconception to imagine that we don't have access to a sense of deep time, and that there are a lot of people who live with a comprehension and appreciation of themselves in deep time, the Haudenosaunee seventh generation principle, thinking as in a lot of indigenous traditions about a sense of a creation myth, a sense of continuity with the beginning of things, and a sense of obligation to ancestors and people not yet born. So I also think that, as Jessica was beautifully saying, that these histories are inside of things like ice, that there are these living archives of deep time, and that I learn about it from people who are committed to listening to non-humans. So these are often people, there are indigenous artists, but also decolonial artists, feminist artists, and a lot of scientists who I think are deeply committed to being co-present with things like glaciers and learning about deep time from them. So that's where I'm continuously reaching to these kinds of viewpoints and perspectives to recenter and connect to the reality of the multiple temporalities that we are existing within.
Yeah, cool. Maybe I can sort of bring Jana in here at some point. I know sort of both as a curator of the show, you had sort of some ideas of bringing also Jessica's work into conversation with some of the objects that we have sort of at the museum that might be 1,000 years old, but in your own work, of course, you have sort of explored sort of deeper histories as well. You want to speak a little bit sort of about deep time in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really appreciative, Clara, of what you just said, bringing an Indigenous perspective and talking about a sense of responsibility to those that came before and those that come after. I think that idea and knowing plays a big part in my work as an artist. And, collaborating with not only humans, but non-humans, and just understanding kind of our place in the world that we're in, and that we also maybe don't see or understand. And in terms of Jessica's show, we've been talking about this for 5 or 6 years, and originally we were talking about having the Letter to the Future project in the same space as objects from the Vanderbilt Museum, their collections that, with objects that are over 1,000 years old or around 1,000 years old, really, in a way, just because trying to understand even what 1,000 years looks like can be challenging. Deep time is a whole other question. But I also think, the idea of proposing what 1,000 years in the future, or what you would say to the future, and then what we learn from looking at art objects and what they're saying to us from the past, is such a beautiful opportunity. And I'll just share a couple of images from the Vanderbilt Museum collection. There are a couple of things that are from the Song Dynasty in China. This bowl with lotus motif, this beautiful celadon ware. And, you just look at this and you think, my God, how did this survive? And you see the hand of the maker and these beautiful colors. This is another Song Dynasty piece. It's an effigy vase in the form of an owl. Also from, around between 960 to 1200. And then this last piece, which I just think is so remarkable, is this Japanese mirror with engraved Buddhist design in it. And, we're looking at these marks of these humans 1,000 years ago who are pondering their place in the universe and trying to conceptualize these spiritual principles and ideas of the Buddha and the human and, non-duality. And you think, my goodness, we're still trying to figure those things out. So there's just so much to learn. And I think that just briefly, as an educator, one of the ideas of having Jessica's work with these objects is just an opportunity for our students to think about, as Billy said, what a small slice of time we're in. We get so focused on the up to the minute and that accelerated pace that we forget. So easy to forget this thing that is actually expands in all directions around us, not just, up and down and forward and back, but really, whatever the word would be, multitudinal. I don't know.
Great. Dan, I mentioned earlier you took some students recently to Antarctica for, I think, a total of 2 months, which I don't know, for you probably felt like a pretty long time already. I don't know whether it's not deep time, but definitely challenging. And you're returning to one and the same place or to similar kind of places over and over again, and not much seems to change. So do you sort of experience sort of deep time in real time in your work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fun question to explore, and it's fun to hear what everyone else contributes to this. Because, yeah, I mean, as an Earth scientist, we think about deep time a lot. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and things are only moving at centimeters every year, but you can scramble the whole Earth over that time frame. And in some ways, as an environmentalist and someone who cares about people and the communities here on the planet, deep time can maybe, on the one hand, make you a little cynical, a little flippant. Earth doesn't care about us. It'll heal after whatever we do to it. But that doesn't account for the sort of the real things that people and communities, human, non-human, the landscapes are actually going through. And I want to think about how deep time helps us develop that ethics of care, how it makes me want to sort of appreciate how delicate and how long it took to create this planet that sustains us. Makes me think a lot more about sort of responsibility and restraint, and preserving it and making sure that the future can have it. And so I really like to think about deep time in a way that's getting out of that, that cynical loop you might fall into, and really make you appreciate what it is that we're doing. And then, yes, when we go down to Antarctica, one of the really fun things that we get to do down there is what I like to say is we get to be time travelers, because we get to go to these landscapes where things change incredibly slowly, where rocks that were left by a glacier 14 million years ago are still right in the exact same place that glacier left them, because these landscapes are so cold and dry and things change incredibly slowly. And so it's easy to put yourself in those shoes of saying, oh, the glacier was right here and it just left this behind 14 million years ago or 4 million years ago. And so, yes, one of the things we think a lot about while we're down there is being time travelers, and that sense of time and how slowly the ice does change. And yeah, we have a lot of fun exploring that while we're down there, and as well as hiking around and collecting lots of rocks and soil samples.
I love what you say about sort of also the curiosity of all of this and the sort of excitement that it produces when sort of bringing this back to Jessica's work and the letters to the future. I mean, one can't help to kind of trying to figure out what's actually in all those letters that are traveling with this glacier for the next 1,000 years. And I know, Jessica, you probably, I mean, you had your fingertips on these letters, and there must have been an impulse to open them at some point, but you withheld, right? You never saw what's inside of those letters.
I never did see what's inside those letters. So I was listening to this idea of responsibility and restraint very carefully. And that question of restraint is quite important, actually.
Maybe we can sort of, before we move on to the next sort of topic, like all of us are thinking a little bit, if we had been, I mentioned earlier, maybe we unseal those letters a little bit from our end, if sort of with all the sensibility, with all the sensitivity towards sort of longer periods of time, to deep time. So if any of you all would write one of those letters to the future, telling a future in 1,000 years or in 1,000,000 years, well, not about what that future is, but sort of how that future should see us today, what would you write? Wants to volunteer?
I'll go ahead and volunteer.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, actually thinking back to, some of the things that Dan had mentioned, about trying to tread more carefully. I hope that, our future descendants are able to look back and see, what we as humans have done, how we've affected our planet, and, have been able to learn from that. And, going back to this concept of deep time, the ice core samples, they have a record, going back tens, thousands to millions of years of what the climate was like, and it has, etched in that for the past couple of hundred years the effects of humans. So I'm hopeful that, if I was to write a letter, I would just basically say, I hope that we were a learning example for everyone, and you've taken all of this into account.
Clara, any thoughts? What would you write?
It's such an interesting exercise. I want to say something like, believe in us or care for us too, that maybe they're asking for that compassion for deep time seems like relevant to the conversation that we're having. And thinking about, yes, that we really are all within history and more complex than we might seem from a great distance.
Jana, any ideas?
This is like an impossible question that only Carlo Rovelli could answer, or Rosie Braidotti, or the magnificent people that you chose to ask, Jessica. I don't know, I might write about beauty. I would probably write about interconnectivity. I don't know, I'm just smiling, sort of thinking about I might just paint a picture and not use words. It feels like art could speak something that, who knows what the language would be that would be received or that would be approaching it. And so might be an image. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I find this to be a really challenging question, and I admire Jessica for doing this and getting it done, because it is incredibly hard. I I always say that I study rocks. I'm not a poet or a writer or anything, right? But so words aren't always my best thing, but I would try, I think, to write something about, yeah, maybe this joy and spirit of being alive, and the connections and the rhythms and that energy that we feel, even though there's a lot going on that isn't heading the right way. Life is still pretty amazing and a real joy, and that hopefully these people in 1,000 years are experiencing it at even grander levels than we get to today. So there'd have to be a little bit of hope and optimism in there as well, I suppose.
That's lovely. Jessica, you didn't add a letter of your own, right, to the capsule that's traveling?
No, I'm laughing because it's like, it's true. It's such a hard thing. And I mean, in a way, I orchestrated it, but I didn't write a letter myself. And I think I'm with Jana, that I think I would probably make a drawing. Maybe because that could be, I don't know. There were a lot of questions also with authors, what kind of language, people chose the language that they wrote in. I do know that there were some drawings, because that was disclosed. I don't know, I didn't see them, but that idea that drawing could really communicate across any language and any barrier, and that the longevity, again, back to this question of the time frame, since the beginning of time, when we think about those early, images in Lascaux caves, or, I mean, I think that there's something so haptic and direct and human about those first, mark makings. It speaks so directly to humans, just these things that you guys are talking about the joy of life, about beauty, about how relevant it is to find symbolic language and symbolic meaning amid, all of the everyday questions of survival. And I think that, that this project in particular also really speaks to that, because it really foregrounds creative acts, and as a proposal for in part survival, for survival, for finding meaning in our brief time here on the planet, and meaning together. So that's a long-winded answer to say, no, I didn't write a letter.
Good. You talk about creativity and meaning making. I think sort of it's a good bridge to the next sort of set of questions and discussions. I mean, it's beautiful to see this kind of interdisciplinary panel, people talking with very different kind of interests and backgrounds about sort of the experience and the meaning of extended durations, extended histories, and sort of this sense of interdisciplinarity is also really at the core of Jessica's practice. It's art that really engages with other fields, with other disciplines as well, and sort of a conversation with earth sciences, so with climate science is sort of really an important part of this as well. And sort of it makes me wonder, when looking at the work as we have it in the museum right now, but looking also at some of the work of our panelists here, sort of the meaning of these kind of interdisciplinary connections, how important, or how important is it that sort of artists and scientists, or artists, scientists and humanists are in a conversation with each other in this kind of moment that we find ourselves today. Sort of what's the point? What's the gain of conversations between artists and scientists? What can one learn from the other? Then, I mean, when you're traveling down in Antarctica with your students, the last thing you probably think about is art. But I'm sort of curious, sort of, is there something for you, also thinking about Jessica's show, for instance, is there something for you where you think like, oh, there's something for me to learn from art? Sort of as a scientist, I can draw from artistic ways of approaching the world, artistic forms of research.
Yeah. It's a really fun question, because sort of true to my liberal arts upbringing and training, right? I really like to blend a lot of these things and find the ways that they're very similar to each other, right? I mean, art and science are really just different ways of trying to communicate knowledge and experience and interpret what we see and how we interact in life. And so what's fun, and a lot of what I do, we're digging pits just with shovels and picks, and we're out there. It's very physical, but you have to interpret the layers of the soil that you see, and there's different shades of color. And the students that have a good art background have really good eyes at interpreting this, and they're used to picking up those subtle differences in color or in texture, or little changes that might be happening that tell you, oh, something different was happening in the glacier that was leaving this dirt behind, right? So I really like thinking about, there's lots of great things we can pull from different ways of being trained, and art trains us in a certain way to think about colors and textures and patterns. And scientists, we do a lot of that too, and looking at patterns and change and texture that way. So there's a lot of really great overlap that way, and it's really something that, I really enjoy thinking about and doing, and thinking what would be the best way to communicate this information. And sometimes that's not just a peer-reviewed journal article, right? Can be other forms of expression that are really helpful that way.
Yeah. I mean, image making, Billy, for you as an astronomer and astrophysicist, plays a really important role as well, right? Often the images that we see through telescopes taken from the stars, there's not just one image, it's like layers and multiple images that are kind of fused and colorized, and there's a lot of art involved in the making of those images as well. What's your relationship as an astrophysicist to the arts? Is there something to be learned, to be gained by having a good artistic eye as well?
I definitely think so. When I was first, or when this question was first brought up, it really made me think about how, as a scientist and somebody that's really focused on, engineering and the science background, that's kind of become an innate part of me because that's how I was trained. So it's very hard for me to kind of get out of that mode of thinking a lot of times, and to be able to bring in other people that have a very strong art background and have them work on a project with me. They're seeing this through a different lens that I would never have seen. Talking about deep time, I would never have seen in a million years. So bringing in all these different viewpoints, it really helps to fill in those little gaps and make whatever you're trying to do, make it a more more fulfilling project. And you spoke about the beautiful images that come back from these telescopes, and yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into making those images, to getting to the final product, because it's typically not just a single image, but there's also some artistic license in that as well, and that gives folks, scientists, a way of, we may have the same image but in various forms, and that can spur different lines of thinking. It can, for some people that may have kind of passed up the image at one point in the past, if it's just tweaked a little bit with the artistic eye, all of a sudden it's grabbing a lot more attention. So whenever we can get art and science and mathematics and everything collaborating, I think that the outcome is just going to be much more powerful.
Well, we can reverse that perspective, Clara. I mean, when you work on performance and in Arctic regions, on the one hand, but also on sort of questions of climate change within a kind of humanistic framework, how important are sort of scientific insights about changing realities for your work up there?
Yeah, I am in a shared boat here where I went to a liberal arts school. My undergraduate degree was in biology, but I always practiced theater. So I spent a couple of years in between degrees helping with all miscellaneous elements of theater making in New York, and then went back to grad school for theater and performance studies to think about why it was that we had so much information and evidence of climate change, but weren't doing anything about it. And with a conviction that art and performance in particular could help people to feel connected to some of this information, that this was a laboratory for communicative strategies. And so the two for me are very intertwined. And just in my first person experience of doing, measuring the acidity of tanks and bromeliads, or painting little dots on ants to track their individual behavior, to like making props in theater, or I think of performance as embodied, creative, iterative practices, and I see a lot of wonderful commonality in science and art. And so I think that they have that there's a methodological kinship there that can really be taken advantage of. I think there's some scientists and artists who don't think of themselves in that way at all and wouldn't want to participate in those kinds of collaborations, but I'm really excited for people like Jessica, for the people that do want to think across disciplines, because I think that we're dealing with issues that are so intertwined with every element of our lives that we need that kind of disobedience of thinking outside of the box to deal with something like climate change. And this is, also following after people like Robin Wall Kimmerer and Kim Tallbear. I think it's an exciting topic, and I could keep talking, but I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, maybe Jana, you want to chime in there a little bit, since we sort of hit this moment, also thinking about, well, not just maybe Western science, but other types of knowing, and sort of the relationships of art and art as a kind of way of maybe exploring knowledges that certain modes of Western science might not be sort of open to. I know that your work addresses some of these issues.
I think you're prompting me to talk
Yes,
about.
I'm prompting you.
Yes. Well, I was recently working in the Smithsonian collections in DC, a lot in the Natural History Museum, actually, and identifying objects that all came from Mackinac Island, a place where my mother's ancestors come from. And, going into these different empirical collections in natural history, my question really had to do with how those disciplines understand animacy and what kind of accommodations they make for Indigenous visitors and also just for the objects themselves. And, there's this incredible place called the Cultural Resources Center, which is part of the National Museum of the American Indian. And the whole building is actually built on the premise that the objects that it contains are animate. And so objects are housed in the kind of geography of the building that relates to where they are from on the planet. And the objects have access to natural light so that they know when it's the time of year that they might do their jobs. And so it's like this kind of thinking that is outside of empirical science it exists, and it is being, there are these incredible, even like I said, buildings being built to accommodate ways of thinking. But even in the same institution, you would go across the river, and then I won't name any names, but you'd be in a collection asking about animacy, and people just said, no, there's nothing animate here. But I think one of the beauties about art is that we can ask these questions, and we can ask them in ways that, one of the people that I worked with, Josh Bell, is really interested in these questions, but it's hard within an institution for the institution to ask itself those questions. And so that's, I think, one of the beauties that artists can ask them in a kind of safe or maybe non-threatening, or just maybe a way that can bring people's attention to different ways of understanding.
Asking questions for which we might not actually have answers, right? But sort of just thinking to push us outside of the box. Talking about questions, I want to encourage also the audience to pose possible questions or comments they have in the live stream YouTube in the comment box, and we'll try to pick up a question here and there. And I have one right now, which I think might be apropos for what we're talking about. One of our audience members asks the following, sort of talking about asking questions. Thinking about everything going on today, I feel that it is wildly optimistic to believe that our species will survive another 1,000 years. And maybe I can bring that question to Jessica at this point, a work that sort of anticipated sort of communicating to a readership in 1,000 years from now, and sort of anticipating what someone will be around to read those messages in 1,000 years. Dan was very optimistic earlier about sort of communicating with the future. I'm sort of curious, Jessica, when you did Letters to the Future, so what were your thoughts about sort of the potential readership or listenership or viewership, whoever opens that capsule in 1,000 years? Is there still someone going to be around?
It's interesting because I actually think that the way I can talk to this is a little bit following up on that last question about the art and science connection, because I was just listening to Jana speaking about the objects, and just hearing you talk about that, like reframing the whole perspective of how can you imagine, the world, and imagining it from a non-human perspective is in a way so compelling. And so it's such a relief in a sense to realize that we're really not in the center, and that there's such an amazing variety of life that we're all interbeing with. I find that to be something, I don't know, I feel like that's something I can really think about for a long time. And also this might be a bit too rambling, but anyway, thinking also about the stars and looking backwards into time and the fact that we're made out of stardust. And I don't know, I've just been thinking a lot lately about how we're made of so many non-human elements. And so this question about our existence, in a sense, like, will we be existing? Like, I don't know. I think the project, is open-ended, and art also really allows that ambiguity and that space of uncertainty. And I think that that's a beautiful thought experiment, to be able to live and lean into that uncertainty, and to also, in a way, extend the thinking a little bit further to what is our existence? What is our, maybe we might be not in this form. I don't know. I mean, and I think ice offers such a beautiful example of transformation. It has so many, the water and the movement between the different forms that it takes. So as humans in our form, I honestly, of course, like, I have no idea. I'm sort of inherently optimistic, but I also, with that, I feel like there's a lot of like, really deep contemplation of what it means that we might not be here, and kind of also, leaning into that too.
Yeah. And so much of I feel letters to the future as well. It is directed at the future, but it is also very much directed as the present, right? It wants us, as we do today, kind of think about what these kind of timeframes actually mean to us, both towards the future and to the past.
Yeah, that we're making our future right now. That's, I think, something so interesting too. It's like this kind of recall forward, that play between then and now.
Yeah. I mean, one of the maybe move on here to the next cluster of questions and discussion points. One of the strong interests of your work is sort of this question about, I guess, the cost and the blessings of discovery, of curiosity, of going out there to produce new kinds of knowledge. Good chunk of the work that's in the museum is really sort of recounting also and rewriting the narrative of polar travel, of research over there, showing also the kind of the colonial history thereof, sort of its implication in sometimes war, sometimes power and control, but also sort of saturated with tropes of certain types of masculine heroism that really marginalized women, for instance, that continues to marginalize indigenous populations, at least in the Arctic. Sort of, I'm curious to hear, well, not just from you, Jessica, but from everyone here on the panel as well, about how much you sort of, when thinking also about deep time and your kind of different scientific and artistic and humanist kind of endeavors, how much you think about sort of the cost or the footprints that your work actually leaves in the world. Jessica's show is entitled "No Footprints Even," and I guess it's hard for us as humanists, as artists, as scientists, not to leave footprints. But I guess we probably think about our footprints quite a bit. So curious, who wants to maybe share some thoughts about leaving footprints or not leaving footprints with their work? Billy, you're probably working, well, okay, you need telescopes, you need observatories, but sort of the distant galaxies that you traverse, you don't leave any footprints there, do you? But you think about footprints?
Well, we try not to, but actually, just thinking about this now, it does bring up something that I've talked with folks about before. Folks that are in the astronomy fields or in space exploration, we're now have been for half a century, to the point where we're now able to to leave our home base here and start to travel outwards, which is a great it's great for science, and it's great for humanity, but it does have its consequences as well. As we're going out and exploring, like we're going to the moon, or maybe we're even going to Mars, I think that, in terms of this, not leaving footprints behind, we're not going to do a very good job of that, I'm afraid. Just thinking about, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, but it's just part of the nature of exploration at the stages that we're at. As we're starting to go to these other locations, we're definitely going to be making an impact wherever we are there. Just even nowadays, there's, as more rockets are launched and satellites are put up, space is becoming more and more cluttered. So it's harder for us to not leave those footprints behind, unfortunately.
I'll jump in with a thought, if I may,
Yeah.
which is that I think the idea of whether or not to leave footprints is maybe this binary is one that we need to challenge, because of course we are living beings. We metabolize, we consume things. There's really no way of existing without having some kind of physical presence. Or maybe not. Maybe that's the next question. But I think something that I've learned from Inuit activists in the context of a mining project in Nunavut is just this, apologies if you can hear my dog, but a practice of patience and a feeling of, in terms of resource use, of something like there's an iron mine there that was operating. An international corporation wanted to expand it into a third phase, extract more. Animals in the area had started turning orange, though, and a lot of hunters and people who relied in part or entirely were dependent on hunting for their livelihoods, were concerned about this. And there is a wonderful documentary filmmaker, Zacharias Canuck, who made a piece at the Winnipeg Art Gallery that I saw that was, a lot of it was just straight footage of a town hall meeting with this corporation and sort of a failure of translation, a failure to communicate. And what the Inuit, some of the representatives of the Inuit group were saying is that it's not that we're against using resources. They're there, they will be there. It's not no, it's just not now. And I think sometimes with Indigenous ecological practices, there's a feeling of, oh, they know ways to leave no trace and to not harm the environment. But we're all having to live with the environment. And I think as we learn more about that Indigenous practices like fire, burning, that there is that there has to be intentional land management and stewardship in some way, but that this issue of capitalist extraction for maximum value as quickly as possible is really, that it is an issue of pacing and of temporality, I think, more than yes or no, off or on.
Thank you. I mean, this might be a good moment to ask actually Jessica, bring it back to Jessica. Part of the show, the Yelcho expedition, is all based on a story by Ursula Le Guin, which sort of underlies much of this work and sort of the narrative. The quote of the show also, actually, the title of the show is the final line of that story. Maybe Jessica, you can talk a bit about that piece of the show, and then we can bring it also, I think, I'm sure Dan and Jana to say some things about footprints as well.
Yeah, I just want to say, Clara, how much I appreciate what you just said, because I mean, Le Guin's utopian feminist story is, in a way, it's like an excuse to be able to pose some questions and, have just some kind of thinking around. I think really what it is that it's just, how are we participating in a way that's sustainable? And I think that's really the question of, because yes, there's a level of impermanence. I mean, we come and we go and things will transform, but, also it's like to what cost, and to how mindful can we be as we're participating with what we're doing. And I think like really that's the one of the goals of the work, is to trigger that kind of questioning. And in her story, it's very tongue in cheek. She uses the tropes of the expedition narratives, and then she kind of ends with that final sentence. So, a beautiful, lovely goal. I also, I mean, I don't see us going in that direction at all, but I do think that, asking these kind of questions are really really relevant. And I definitely think, indigenous knowledge in the Arctic is a very good guideline for where, what we can look at for, how to move forward, as the poles are obviously increasingly becoming more and more accessible. And the polar regions, like space, represent these realms of inaccessibility that are no longer inaccessible, and that are full of materials that the world seems to be just insatiable for. So it's really just being able to ask those questions.
I mean, for those who are not familiar with the story, so Ursula Le Guin's Sur story from, it's like 1982 or so, if I recall correctly, tells the story of 9 female explorers, or is it 11, that go to Antarctica and in fact reach the South Pole before anyone else reaches it. It's contrafactual, but it's quite beautiful and tongue-in-cheek, as you say. And then they return and decide that they don't want to leave any documents to anyone. They don't want to sort of be celebrated for this heroism, and all the reports and all the accounts are kind of hidden, basically. So no one learns about it. And this kind of gesture of not sharing, of not praising, of not leaving documents, of not leaving footprints becomes sort of a model and idea of how to, I guess, how to be in the world, how to maybe tread the world a little more lightly. Dan, do you leave footprints when you're down in Antarctica?
Well, this is a really fun question, and it makes me want to show about a 1,000 pictures. But for fun, I'll show a few pictures, because it's something we think a lot about while we're down there. So when we go down to Antarctica, it is kind of fascinating. It's governed by treaty, and it has a really strong environmental protection that governs it all. And we have a really strong leave no trace ethic that we practice down there. And so we try to leave as little as we can, although footprints will probably always happen. So just really briefly to show you, this was what we call our vampire team, because our project was designed to look at the source, what we call the provenance of glacial sediments that are left down there, which is kind of fun to think about a provenance in an art term as well, right? And this is our team that was down there. So thinking about sort of the masculine, heroes that we often think about with Antarctica, this was a team entirely of women besides me. So Dr. Rebecca Stanton in the upper left was a postdoc, and the other 3 are actually all Vanderbilt undergraduate students. We have Lauren Lamson, Sophie Lopez, and Zoe Storsley are the rest of our vampire team. And I tried to find pictures of them looking happy and collecting samples for their science projects down there. And again, I just want to do this briefly, but it is kind of fun to think about the old explorers. When we fly down, we fly through New Zealand. We get to see the statue of Robert Scott that his wife sculpted for him. We get to see his hut that he built in 1902 that is still there, and get into it and see the history is very much alive down there. But then we go out and we actually camped for 40 days straight. So just to give you a couple of images from our camping experience, we set up a little site. Helicopters will drop us off. We set up a little site with tents to sleep in, tents to cook in, bathroom tents. We all have little roles that we take on. We have a certain rhythm to camp life that exists in chores and wake up times and daily rhythms of collecting samples and everything down there. And so it's fascinating. Everything that we bring in with us has to come out with us as well. We don't have any running water. We're not showering for 40 days is what that means. All our waste is coming out with us. And they're pretty amazing landscapes down there when you're talking about the sort of non-human aspects. This is a part of the world where there are not any indigenous humans that ever populated it, because it's too cold and too dry. And when you see these landscapes, you don't see bushes and trees or anything, and they look almost barren. But what's wild is there might not be anything that you visibly see, but there's amazing microscopic life in all these soils, and these amazing organisms have adapted in incredible ways to be cold and dry for thousands of years. But if there's a little bit of moisture that they get in the soils for even just a few hours, they'll spring into life, into activity. They'll do what they can, and then they'll just wait patiently for maybe the next 1,000 years when it finally melts out a little bit and gets them warm. But I was thinking about footprints, so I grabbed one last picture because it is wild when you're down there. These are, hopefully you can see that there are tire tracks. There was a group from New Zealand that drove a Jeep through this valley in 1962, and the tracks are still there, and you can see them. And then they go for 30 miles or so from the coast all the way down to this lake in the middle of the valley. And so things like footprints really do last in these really pristine environments that are down there. Again, what's interesting thinking about the treaty, it makes me think that there's actually a couple corners of some of these valleys we go to where no one has ever been, and they're sort of locked off, and they don't want anyone to ever go there because they want to keep some parts of Antarctica that are in that state that no one's ever gone and added their footprints to them. So it's fascinating while we're down there. There's a lot of fun themes that we could think about while we're there. And yeah, there's a lot of really fun things to go. And I think maybe the last thought I might just share quickly, what I love about this question is it's sort of the same thing that makes me one of my favorite questions to ask my students, which is, you know, do you view yourself as someone who's sort of apart from nature, separate, or do you view yourself a part of nature? And you know, can we leave no footprints, or will we always have footprints? It's kind of a very similar question to me. Thanks.
Or is leaving footprints part of our nature, right? But we just
yeah,
it's really interesting. Jana, you have some thoughts?
I think somewhere between Billy and Dan, there's this kind of crazy image between the image of all of the space junk and trash that's kind of floating around out there, and then like the Edward Bertinsky photographs of, you know, what happens to all of our phones and electronics and, you know, all of the, you know, those crazy trash pictures. But then I think about what Jessica said about Lascaux, and maybe not footprints, but handprints, or, you know, those early images where someone's blowing pigment and we get the leftover of that human hand, or the Nazca lines, or, you know, other serpent mounds. And so I guess I think it depends on what kind of footprints we're talking about, really. And I think probably all of us, because we're interested in climate, we're trying to live responsibly and lightly. And but I just want to make a case for, you know, the footprint of art and beauty.
On that note, there were few visitors in the gallery the other day, and I was there, and they asked me questions about what's inside the tube that's traveling down the glacier, and what media was used, and they were a little astonished by, I assume it's just pieces of paper, and they were concerned about whether that paper would still exist in 1,000 years, talking about that footprint. And my answer was, and Jessica, confirm or don't confirm, but I was sort of saying, well, paper has proven to be a pretty good and sustainable technology over the centuries. And sort of the prints that we leave on paper probably last much longer than some of the digital prints that we're leaving. Is it paper inside those in the tube? And are you concerned about how long that will last?
I mean, it is archival. It's archival paper and archival ink. So that should do the trick. I consulted with some you know, paper conservators, and I've followed their recommendations, and I supplied the contributors with the materials. So, I mean, I think if anything, there could be like maybe an issue with the glue on the envelope, but the paper inside should be okay. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing within the context of the whole exhibit, no footprints, but there is, you know, the proverbial elephant in the room, which is the time capsule is left there, and that to make, you know, to reiterate or echo or you know, what Jana is saying is that the cultural artifact and how relevant, you know, those gestures really are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We got since we just shortly ago talked about Le Guin's story, Sir. We received one question from the audience, which I would like to ask you, Jessica. At this point, the person was wondering, when working on the exhibition, when working on the work for the exhibition, did you consult works other than Sir? Sort of what are your maybe sort of some of your intellectual, scholarly, critical kind of resources when working on the kind of themes that you explore in your work?
Well, for that particular, yeah, for those particular paintings, I was also very influenced by Elena Glassberg's Antarctica as Cultural Critique, and also by Lisa Bloom's work. So I think those are like my two kind of conceptual footholds in that. But also with the Letters Project, I mean, I really was very influenced by a lot of the contributors' work, you know, ranging from like Rosie Braidotti to Carlo Rovelli to, you know, also poets like Anne Michaels, and I don't know. So there's a lot of, I mean, I do a lot of research, so it's actually hard to just name, you know, but for the Yelcho thing, I mean, Elena Glassberg and Lisa Bloom are very sort of, you know, forefront. So.
Great, thank you. Why don't we move to the kind of lots of what is in the exhibition, the last section. It's called the Magnetic Observatory, where sort of Jessica kind of connects, well, I guess, certain kind of scientific concepts such as magnetism to much larger cosmological and spiritual dimensions. There's a kind of back and forth between the visible and the invisible, the physical and the metaphysical, partly also informed by some work that Ursula Le Guin has been doing. And it sort of raises the question of the relationship of, well, science, of art, and sort of the kind of evidentiary logic of Western science to much larger spiritual kind of dimensions. These paintings, maybe we'll, Jana, do you want to describe a little bit that section for us as a curator?
I feel like we should show some of those images because they're kind of hard to describe. And anyway, I think it would be better for Jessica to describe it because there's multiple elements happening, right? There's a little installation that has a book recounting Captain Scott's journey, and then it has these magnetic lodestones sitting on top of it, and that's paired with a little beautiful painting and a poem by from the Tao Te Ching that was translated by Ursula Le Guin back to Le Guin, and then there's a series of these really beautiful color-filled paintings where Jessica is looking at magnetism from a really wide range of resources, everything from, I mean, she should be talking about this, but everything from alchemy to Islamic texts to Tantra paintings to, you know, different imaginings of how people have tried to picture what the Earth's magnetism might look like. And then I think, as she will probably describe to you while working on those, you know, there's a kind of beauty of what happens between the maker and the painting and this kind of reciprocal relationship that happens. So she's not depicting magnetism, you know, like factually, right? It's more about trying to sort of imagine how you would present energy fields and the fields that that affect us. Okay, jump in here. And
no, that's really beautifully said. I appreciate that. I think that it also has to do a little bit with Lutz, with your first, or one of your earlier questions about just the importance of interdisciplinary conversations. And, you know, in general, I think how materials inform our thinking as much as our thinking informs materials, whether you're an artist or a geologist or, you know, this kind of interrelationship, I think really what we're talking about between, you know, the self and the environment even. And so as an artist, it's like that question of, okay, well, this will work better as a photograph, as a sort of documentary conceptual piece. And those works really draw on the legacy of abstraction as a way to speak about invisible things and acknowledge the reality of what is here beyond the eye, and how relevant that is to our human experience, and then the joy of that in painting, and to try to, you know, experiment with the language of painting and color to create something that's dynamic and moving, but still that can provide a point of contemplation of you know, the kind of things that are here that we don't necessarily see.
Invisible things that are nevertheless very elemental and essential for life on Earth. Like, this would be a good moment to actually have Billy as the sort of resident astrophysicist here in this panel tell us a little bit about sort of how important magnetism actually is for us here on this planet.
Well, you know, aside from obviously our technological use of it, you know, magnetism has been shown to, you know, be used by a wide variety of life on the Earth. For example, as some birds are migrating, they're actually able to guide themselves a little bit with you know, the magnetic field of the Earth. So, and I'm sure there's lots more examples out there that I'm not going to get today, but yeah, life here has evolved to, you know, to live off of this or be guided by, you know, these things that we can't readily see. So, and you know, and also just kind of talking about, you know, the how we're kind of blending in spirituality with, you know, things that we're not, you know, just readily seeing or maybe readily thinking about every day. Something that Jessica mentioned earlier was, you know, that we're made of star stuff. So yeah, and that's quite literally true. The atoms in our body that, you know, we think of, okay, well, they came from the Earth. Well, where did the Earth come from? Well, that formed 4.5 billion years ago. Well, where did all that stuff come from? And that came from, you know, previous generations of stars that died out literally billions of years ago. So for me, you know, just in thinking in terms of spirituality and how that ties into, you know, science and things, it's something just to, for, you know, me speaking personally, to just think about how, you know, everything in my body, or pretty much everything in my body, was once inside of a star that lived billions of years ago. So I may have gone off on a little tangent there, but, you know, hopefully that kind of helped to address that just a bit there.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can bring Clara back in the discussion here as well with a question. I mean, in your work, in your engagement with sort of Arctic artistic traditions, but also populations, do you come across these kind of longer cosmological perspectives as well, and how do they speak to you? How do you speak to them?
I do, and I don't really speak of them in the context of my research, because it feels like it's nice to sort of preserve an appreciation for some of these things without my analytic mind, or trying to account for these cosmologies that I sort of can glimpse, but don't necessarily, you know, I'm not an authority on. But I think, yeah, I think it's wonderful to remain open to that and to create space for that in this conversation. I really appreciated that part of the exhibit, and was just reminded of how amazing I thought magnets were as a little kid, going to a magic shop and seeing these very basic mechanisms of trickery that that there are, yeah, these elemental things that we live with that remain very beguiling and just sort of delightful.
Dan, when you carry out work, travel in Antarctica, I mean, part of Jessica's show is really also to engage with these tropes of the sublime in Arctic art and Arctic sort of representations of and images of Antarctica. Sort of these images that sort of vast landscapes with tiny little humans that show us how minuscule we actually are, and that has become kind of a trope as well. And in her work, she's kind of challenging that a little bit. But I can imagine that these kind of experiences, these sort of discoveries of how minuscule we actually are in this larger kind of world that is around us, must be something that very striking when you're down in those valleys that you showed us earlier in your images.
Yeah, it does strike you pretty much right in the face, because yeah, there's nothing growing out there that you could see. There's nothing that can sustain life. You know, we're totally dependent on the helicopters that drop us off and bring in the food that's canned or frozen or dehydrated and preserved, right? So it certainly makes you very aware of what it takes to sustain life, and how much energy we're using, and how much propane we're burning to melt snow to just have drinking water to stay alive down there. So it's kind of amazing. Those simple functions of just staying alive every day are very apparent. And I do like to sort of tease that, like, it's great because life is very simple. My job down there is to stay warm, eat as much food as I can to basically stay warm down there, and collect rocks and soil and different samples. And I find that refreshing and really nice. We don't have internet access for 40 days. We're not, yeah, life gets very simple and very focused, and very, the five of us are a little family in some ways for 5 days down there. It's not hard to imagine yourself as a bunch of astronauts on Mars or someplace like that. So, those sort of classic images, it is hard because they are right there in your face, and it's kind of amazing, right? But on the other hand, it's never as simple as that. Like, it looks totally barren, but then you realize, yeah, there's actually microscopic life in all these things. And one of the things we test for is actually organic carbon, and all the soils we bring back are 1-2% organic carbon, and you don't see it, but it's in there. It's hiding. Some of it's actually in the outer layers of the rocks. So these incredible, called cryptoendolithic bacteria that actually live inside all the cracks and behind the outer layers of rock. So there are amazing things down there that are a little unseen, and yeah, it's not a barren landscape. It's actually kind of a thriving ecosystem. It's just completely different from anything we usually see down here. So yeah, it's quite an experience to be down there.
It's neither timeless nor is it lifeless, right? In spite of
Yeah.
everything, what it looks like, we always think of these landscapes as sort of timeless landscapes,
Yeah.
because they don't seem to move and don't seem to change. But there's some deep time, there's some very timeful kind of energy in those kind of places, and I think that sort of speaks also to the topics of the magnetic observatory so much, where sort of the visible and the invisible somewhat penetrate each other. I know, Jana, you wanted to share some images of the magnetic observatory, which might be a good moment to share at this point with the audience before we sort of hit the final moments.
Yeah, I also think that, one of the themes that's really, and I'll just speak while I show you these images because they're so beautiful. But one of the things that I think is really important about Jessica's show is she's like really positioning us between the real and the imagined. And the thing that these paintings do, which I find so fascinating, and for people who haven't seen the exhibition, there's photography, collages, paintings, and a little installation. And the other day we were talking about how we understand what is real versus what is imagined. And there's this kind of beautiful irony in the show because there are these photographs that maybe we think of as being real, but who knows these days with photography, right? And then you have these paintings about magnetism, or this section called the Magnetic Observatory. And as Billy said earlier, nothing could be more real than magnetism. It's just that we don't see it, or we don't necessarily, totally get, we can't, it's really hard to visualize it, but it is intrinsic to our experience on this planet. And so that space between the real and the imagined, again, is the space that art can occupy. And I think that Jessica does such a beautiful job of illuminating that for us in the exhibition.
Good moment to ask one more question that we received from the audience, perhaps sort of the final question to be raised here. I think it's very fitting. One audience member writes the following: Thanks for the interesting insights. A general question, and I think that goes to all of you. A general question: where do you do your best creative thinking and/or scientific contemplating? In what kind of spaces do you find your deepest focus? Jana, you're on right now, still on the big screen. You have a thought
Oh,
on
I
that?
am.
Yes.
Well, I want to say on Mackinac Island, that's where where I feel most connected to place. But I will say quite a bit of my thinking happens while I'm driving. Like, so when I'm on road trips and I have a long period of time where I'm not talking to anyone or listening to anything, I feel like something happens in those kind of liminal spaces between one location and another, whether it's driving or on airplanes or walking. It's just these kind of in between travel spaces where I feel like my thoughts are most clear.
Billy, how about you?
Actually, it made me smile a little bit because I'm a lot like Jana. It's when I'm driving, which then makes me wonder, okay, was I actually paying attention? But, just these points where I'm not interacting with people, I'm doing things that aren't, super engaging. First thing that came to mind was a lot of times when I'm mowing the lawn, I'm just sitting there kind of thinking through things. And then, yeah, it's kind of like when I'm on autopilot, just doing little mundane tasks. If I sit here and try to really focus, that often doesn't work. So I just got to find something to kind of occupy myself, and then suddenly the thoughts just start to flow.
Clara, how about you?
Motion helps me too, running, walking, having sort of a wash of the world to stimulate me just a little bit. But yeah. I like sitting under trees. I feel like being physically grounded with something to lean on can really open things up in my head.
How about you, Dan? What inspires you?
Well, sometimes it's being on a walk or a hike or something, but in terms of writing, when I need to do that, I really still like coffee shops. I like being surrounded by other people. Caffeine certainly helps, but I like being surrounded actually by a certain amount of just other energy and things and stuff going on, and somehow that lets me focus a little bit more, and not get so distracted. Sometimes too much quiet is hard for me.
Maybe we close with Jessica.
I also find that movement helps. So walking, it's definitely a kind of nice thinking happens there. And when my hands are busy, so when I'm in the studio, I really, there's a certain kind of, like I love that Bruce Nauman work about the artist in the studio, because I feel like the studio is like the mind and body, so this kind of way of the things that you pick up and put down, or when you're sort of painting or doing something, there's some other kind of thought process that comes into play that is very unpredictable, and I really appreciate that, the surprises that happen in the physicality of the making space in the studio.
Good. I think we are sort of pretty much at the end of our time. I don't see any more questions right now coming from our audience. So let me thank you all, the panelists, Jessica, Dan, Billy, Jana, and Clara, to sort of making time tonight and sharing all these wonderful thoughts and being in conversation with each other about, well, from very different viewpoints about sort of similar kind of questions. And really with very illuminating insights. Thank you so much. Thanks to, again, Marianne, to Billy Teets, to make this possible, to the Vanderbilt Museum of Art, to actually staging Jessica's show. No Footprints Even will be open until May 11th. It's in Cohen Hall on the Peabody campus at Vanderbilt. If you're in the Nashville area, make sure you pay a visit. I think during the week it's open from 11 to 4, if I'm not mistaken. On the weekend, it's from 1 through 5. If you're not in the area, if you sort of watch this program from somewhere away, make sure you visit the museum's website. It actually has a very detailed guide of the show with all the wall text and fairly high resolution sort of copies of the images. So you get a good sense of all the work that we actually talked about. And yes, before we came together, before we went live, we briefly discussed that we were all kind of sad that we were actually not able to sit all together at Dyer Observatory tonight and have this conversation in person, and maybe also peek through the telescope at some point to see the distant stars and breathe in an air of sort of galactic deep time. But we also said that we hope to be able at some point in the not so distant future to come together again, maybe hopefully at Dyer Observatory, and do a different kind of program and continue this kind of discussion. And with that, let me thank you all, also the audience, for the time that you've making tonight. I hope we found that inspiring, and wish you a good evening. Good night.